Okay, so I want to walk through some settings in Pro Tools surrounding the inputs and outputs that it sees, the audio inputs and audio outputs. So Pro Tools has something that it calls the playback engine, which is basically the device that it uses to get all of its inputs and outputs, right? And that could be a number of things, right? That could be a set of headphones, that could be a microphone, like a USB microphone or a built in microphone. It could be an audio interface, right? And so, what often happens is if I go to choose a playback engine here and I wanted to choose something like, say, my MacBook Pro speakers, right? So, those are my internal speakers. I'm not going to switch that yet. But if I chose MacBook Pro speakers, that would mean that the only audio inputs or outputs that the system could access would be from the MacBook Pro speakers. Now, it's not going to be able to get any input from the speakers because the speakers are in fact an output in this case, right? So choosing speakers means that I can't actually use any inputs into Pro Tools. So, okay, so maybe I want to choose MacBook Pro microphone instead. So if I choose that, I have an input, so I could record something through that microphone, for example, but I couldn't listen to it because there's no active outputs that it's connected to, right? And so, what you might want to do in that case, as I said, so digital audio interfaces uh, give you built-in inputs and outputs. So they have things like, anywhere from 1 to, 16 and up inputs where you can plug microphones into the interface. You can also plug speakers, external speakers or headphones into an interface as well. So you can access all of those different inputs and outputs through one device, which means, okay, that's great. I can just choose my interface. So in this case, I have an interface that I could select, and I could access all the inputs and outputs that that interface has on board by selecting the interface as my playback engine. That's great if you have an interface and if you have all of the things connected to the interface that gives you inputs and outputs. If you want to bundle things, so for example, so maybe you wanted to use your internal microphone, right? But you also wanted to use headphones. Now, I will say that the internal microphone on most computers is not very good quality, but it's a microphone, right? It works. And so if you ever want to use that and listen to what you're recording at the same time, I would highly recommend not using a built-in microphone and built-in speakers at the same time unless you want to listen to um, pretty horrendous feedback. But if you choose, um, say you wanted to bundle the microphone and external headphones, that would be something that you could record with and then listen back on the headphone. So that could be useful. So to do that kind of thing, they have what are called aggregate I/O devices. So aggregate meaning it's taking inputs and outputs from multiple devices and bundling it into one device. So it's almost tricking the computer into thinking that multiple devices are actually one device. And you could bundle, anything you want really. Um, so if, like I said, if you wanted to bundle the microphone and external headphones, or for example, maybe you wanted to bundle a USB microphone. So USB microphones are really popular. It's a great way to get an input into your system. And, it's definitely multiple steps above the internal microphone on your computer. But if you also want to be able to listen back at the same time, you would need to be able to bundle your USB microphone with some sort of output if you want to have inputs and outputs. So that's essentially the gist of what an aggregate I/O device is, and that's why you might choose an aggregate I/O device in Pro Tools or in any other piece of audio software, right? So a number of other softwares have the ability to use an aggregate I/O device. Essentially, it just shows up as its own audio device that multiple things could connect to. So how do we set it up? So I'm on a Mac, and Mac has its own software for this. If you're on a Windows machine, there is a third-party software called ASIO for All, and that allows you to bundle multiple inputs and outputs together into an aggregate I/O device. If you're on a Mac, if you go to Setup inside of Pro Tools and go to Hardware, you'll see any peripheral, so that's any input or output devices that are actively connected to Pro Tools. But you can also hit Launch Setup App, and this is where you can set up an aggregate I/O device, or set up really any input or output device. This is also a native application on Mac OS. So if you go to Applications, Utilities, you'll find this software called Audio MIDI Setup, which allows you to manipulate your audio inputs and outputs, and also your MIDI inputs and outputs. So if I want to do this here, I can go to Pro Tools Aggregate I/O and set it up that way. But you could also, for example, you could just create your own aggregate IOs, right? So you could click this little plus and go to Create Aggregate Device, and you could bundle whatever you wanted together, inputs and outputs. For now, I'm just going to stick with the Pro Tools Aggregate IO, and I'll set up a couple different aggregate IO devices so we can see how those might be able to be worked into Pro Tools. So as I said, if you want to use built-in microphone, right? So there's our built-in mic, and I'm going to use external headphones. So that's bundling those two things together into one aggregate I/O device. Clock source is basically asking it what you want to establish a clock sync off of. In this case, I think I'm just going to go with my headphones. If there is a external device that's a pro audio device, usually I would select to choose the clock off of that, because it's the clock of a device like that that's designed to be a higher quality audio device is generally going to be a little better than internal clocks. But and then I could choose, different sample rates depending on what's supported by the devices. And you just want to make sure that whatever sample rate you choose matches with your sample rate in your session. So I have my microphone and my external headphones that's set up. So now I can go into Pro Tools, and it's saying basically, hey, you changed something. This doesn't match, right? You updated these settings. Can we save and close the session, or close the session so we can relaunch with your new settings? So I'm going to do that. And now a couple things you want to keep in mind. So we went over hardware, playback engine to select the playback engine. You also want to always check the I/O window, setup I/O. So I/O, again, is just inputs and outputs. And by default, it's going to show you what active inputs and outputs it has access to. So in this case, I click the Input tab, and we see that there's a singular one-channel or mono input. And if I click on Output, it's two-channel output, so stereo output in this case. I know that my single input is my built-in mic, and my stereo output is my external headphones, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to New Path, and that's going to create, in this case, a mono input. So I can name this. I can just call this built-in mic. And I can go to my output, and I can do a new path, and this is going to be stereo, so I want to choose stereo here, and I'm going to call this headphones. And again, this is just my headphones hooked into my 1/8" headphone jack on the outside of my computer. So I've now set that up. The other thing you want to check is bus, and this would allow you to see internal buses, but also what your output bus is, which is just telling it what place to send the output to. So in this case, headphones is selected as the output bus, so the bus just to map to the output here. So that's selected there. So I'll hit OK. And now if I create a new track, and I'll just create a mono track because it's a mono built-in mic. So the built-in mic shows up as my input, and I can go to output, and my headphones show up as my output. Perfect. So now I can record in with the mic. Again, it's not the best quality, but to give you the option to be able to record with that and listen back at the same time, it's much better than using one or the other without having both at the same time. So that's built-in mic and headphones. If I want to go back to audio MIDI setup and try a little different setup, as soon as I uncheck this, Pro Tools will get a little angry with me because I've changed the settings again. But I'm going to switch to my blue snowball as an input and my headphones as an output. So in this case, again, it's the external headphones that are plugged into my headphone jack on the computer. Blue Snowball is my input. Again, this is a big step up for my internal mic, but it also, it doesn't have a built-in output on it. So to be able to bundle that higher quality microphone with an output so that I can listen to what I'm bringing into this to the system or recording, um, to bundle those together is perfect. So in this case, I'm going to set the clock source as the Snowball because that is an external device that's decent quality. So I'll use that as my clock. And so you'll notice that the Blue Snowball has two inputs. There's a couple different configurations for the Blue Snowball where you can use it as a mono input, mono source, stereo source. So I'm just going to use one of these, but it does have two available if I wanted to use it as a stereo input. So that's now set up. I'll go back to my session, hit save and close, and I'll notice that if I go back to, so Playback Engine is still set to Pro Tools Aggregate I/O because I just changed the devices that were connected to the Aggregate I/O. But if I go to I/O here, the Setup I/O window, things are a little different, right? So it says built-in mic still because that was what was there. And you'll notice that there are two sources here. So you can you rename these if you want. So if I want to call this Snowball, I could call this Blue Snowball. And again, I'm just going to use one source for now. That's my input. My output is still external headphones, and my bus is still going to my external headphones, my output bus here. So now I'll hit OK, and I'll look back at my track here, and I'll notice that under Interface, my Blue Snowball is listed, and under Output, my headphones are still listed. So there's a couple different configurations that where using the aggregate I/O device can bundle multiple things together to connect different inputs and outputs into one playback engine in Pro Tools. There are other scenarios where you can use this where, say, you wanted to bundle, if you had a couple smaller audio interfaces, you could bundle them together. You can run into a few issues with latency depending on how they're set up. But this can be a really useful tool if you have different devices and need to kind of use them all at the same time inside of one session. So I hope that's helpful, and take care.